Happy Wednesday. I hope you guys are having a good week so far. I just wanted to make a video and answer some of the questions that you guys had earlier in the week about postmodernism because they were really good questions. I'm going to try to go through them quickly because there are lots for your class. So to start, someone asked what is significantly different about postmodernism compared to all the other eras in literature. It seems like postmodernism is just a compilation of everything and isn't bringing anything new to the table. Well, this is one of those things like, uh, you know, a really modern, simplistic piece of art seems like it's easy to make, but you had to be the first person who made it, right? So postmodernism is doing that a lot. I mean, that is a big part of it, but you also have to remember that it was the first time different genres had been combined. That may seem like a cop-out and not like something exactly new. What can I say? But that's kind of what it is. Why do authors use hyperreality in stories? I think I would try to take away that the big idea of hyperreality is to emphasize how much we live in a consumer culture and how much we're advertised to, and hyperreality kind of overemphasizes that in order to get the point across. How have some older movements in American literature, such as realism and transcendentalism, influenced postmodernism? That's a great question. Realism, I think postmodern thinkers and writers really like to play around with realism and question realism. And they like to play around with those dialects in realism too. So maybe like overemphasizing the dialects, maybe using the dialects out of place. But when the dialect happens, still really representing it truthfully, just so you kind of mess around with it and play with it. I'm not sure about transcendentalism. I've never noticed that a lot of transcendental ideas are put in postmodernism because it's more concerned with like the consumer culture during the time period it was written. But I'd say if it were in there, it's probably making fun of it like everything else. Somebody asked, why not a more descriptive name? I hear you. Postmodernism, the name sounds like a cop-out. It just saying it comes after modernism. But I also think that truly it's a movement that's so mixed and contains so many elements that it would be hard to pick a name that really truly represented all of that. Yeah, that's my best answer for that one. Does postmodernism bleed over into film, and do we see a history of other genres in film too? Yes, absolutely. So I think Quentin Tarantino does this a lot. He kind of, like when he was younger, watched Western movies, like Western, spaghetti Westerns, and he likes to reference that in his movies, like in Pulp Fiction. And there are many other film directors and movies that mix these genres and kind of play with them. One of my favorite shows from the 80s is called Twin Peaks, and it's like a spin-off on a soap opera, and a detective story, but just really wacky. So yes, that's a really good question. How do we know the difference when the story could be both? I think this is asking how do we know whether a story is like one element of postmodernism versus another. And I will say that most stories will contain many elements of postmodernism. So don't worry about that. You're never going to have to say like this story is hyperreality and that is it. It's probably going to contain many. Probably no story will contain all 10 though. That would just be a lot to have going on in a story. Okay, so somebody asked, when you talked about irony and playfulness, would it be the same like the yellow wallpaper where somebody has a wild imagination? I would say you could see some beginnings of playfulness in the telling of the yellow wallpaper, and even maybe a little bit of like magical realism or something, because it's a bit unclear where, her reality ends and begins. So yeah, I think that while that's definitely a modernist story, you can kind of see the beginnings of some of that. Somebody asked, why do the characters have super weird names? I think you're referring to like Major, 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 and Yosari. And in my example, Not all characters in postmodern stories have weird names like that, but when they do, it's to somehow play around and be ironic. What would determine the end of the postmodern movement if it hasn't already ended? So the postmodern art movement really extends a lot further than the postmodern literary movement, but the literary movement, I think most people say it began in the 60s and ended in the 80s. So it wasn't super long as movements go. Do magical realism and hyperrealism ever occur in the same story? They seem contradictory, but I might just not understand them enough. I can see why you think they seem contradictory, but hyperrealism isn't really like, that doesn't mean the same thing as very realistic. It actually, hyperrealism is sometimes very unrealistic because in hyperrealism, they're trying to portray how much we are advertised to and just constantly bombarded with advertising. And so sometimes they overemphasize that and it becomes kind of unrealistic. So I think that they could be combined in the same story. Somebody asked what happened to create so much paranoia, such as such a dislike for authority. Well, one big thing in the 60s was the Vietnam era and the Watergate scandal. I'm not going to go into a detailed description of the Watergate scandal here, but with those two things, sorry, my phone was ringing. With those two things, Americans really felt lied to. And I think that as technology increased, it also increased the sense of paranoia. Somebody says, I still can't understand if this was the darker, gloomier side of things or the happier side of things. Oh, I don't know about that. It was pretty pessimistic, but also really liked to have a lot more fun with it. So I don't know. You see what you think by the end of this movement. I think both. Sorry, that's an unsatisfying answer. All right. I think that's all of the questions. I hope that you all enjoy reading I Bought a Little City. And let me know if you have questions about that. And I hope you all have a good rest of your week.